Our lives and livelihoods are shaped by our local climate. It affects nearly all aspects of our economy, society, and the environment. People that live and work in coastal communities are well aware of the risks of adverse weather events. Cyclones, flooding, storm surges, extreme winds, and droughts are just a few of the challenges to local livelihoods. Coastal communities, particularly in developing countries, will be among the most affected by increases in extreme weather events, coastal erosion, and sea level rise as climate change progresses. Anticipating the adverse effects of climate change and taking appropriate action to prevent or minimize damage will be an important aspect of promoting long-term sustainable development. Examples of adaptation measures include using scarce water resources more efficiently, adapting building codes to minimize damage from future climate conditions and extreme weather events, building flood defenses, avoiding building settlements in areas of significant risk, developing drought-tolerant crops, choosing tree species and forestry practices that are less vulnerable to storms and fires, setting aside land corridors to help species migrate, and protecting coral reefs as fish habitat, storm protection, and tourism assets. But how will we know which adaptation measures are the most appropriate? Which actions and investments represent good value for money? To answer those questions, we need to make use of economic assessment tools. The purpose of this video is to describe a proposed pilot project activity to estimate the economic costs of climate change impacts on coastal communities in the Indian Ocean region. The activity is intended to help communities and government planners to identify and evaluate local actions that would help to reduce weather-related risks and adapt to long-term changes to climate conditions, including changes to temperature, precipitation, sea level rise, and extreme weather events. This pilot activity is one outcome of a program of activities initiated by ISLANDS and the Western Indian Ocean Coastal Challenge. ISLANDS is a project of the Indian Ocean Commission, financed by the European Union. It is designed to promote sustainable development in the Indian Ocean region. The Western Indian Ocean Coastal Challenge was established in 2012 to build momentum for the implementation of international and regional agreements, projects and activities that address key issues such as climate change, biodiversity conservation, desertification, and sustainable development. The economic pilot activity that is discussed in this video is being planned and implemented with the help of economists and climate change experts at the University of the Sunshine Coast in Australia. The activity is intended to build the skills and capabilities of local organizations to undertake climate change assessments and respond to increased risks by identifying and implementing appropriate actions to adapt. The success of the project will depend on local organizations getting involved in the activities. The lessons learned in the pilot phase will be incorporated into the region-wide implementation of economic assessments that will ultimately include activities in Madagascar, the Republic of Mauritius, the Seychelles, La France Réunion, the Union of Comores, Zanzibar, Mozambique, and Kenya. This video will provide a brief explanation of some key climate change adaptation concepts. Then it will describe the steps involved in assessing the costs of climate change impacts and evaluating adaptation options by way of several examples. At the end of the video, you should have a better sense of the purpose of the proposed pilot activity, the types of actions that will be involved, how it could benefit your local community, and what role your organization might play in the successful implementation of the activity. The project objectives include undertaking high-quality assessments of the economic costs of specific climate change impacts on key sectors affecting food security and economic development in the coastal zones of Eastern and Southern Africa and Indian Ocean countries, and to use that information to evaluate the most appropriate adaptation and risk reduction policies and investment strategies. The project objectives also include developing communications products to inform decision-makers about the costs of climate change impacts and the need to evaluate and plan for the implementation of appropriate adaptation measures. As well, the objectives include providing the basis, that is, a methodology, process of collecting data, techniques and tools and so on, to build the capacity for in-country replication and extension of the economic assessment of climate change impacts to other regions and sectors, including agriculture, water resources, buildings and infrastructure, health, transportation, industry, and tourism. The expected project outcomes include that experts within the partner countries will have the skills, knowledge, and methods in order to investigate and compare the economic costs of climate change impacts with the costs of adaptation measures in order to make informed decisions about investment, planning, and policy development. Another expected outcome is that decision-makers in government and private sector, as well as community stakeholders, incorporate information on the economic costs of climate change impacts into project and investment planning and financing within their local region. Many very worthwhile climate change studies have already taken place in your country and across the region. This pilot activity is intended to complement, not duplicate, earlier activities. Some of the earlier activities to investigate and plan for climate change include climate impact and vulnerability studies, national communications to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and possibly computable general equilibrium models or partial equilibrium models to look at the impacts of climate change on particular sectors of the economy. Earlier studies would also include adaptation strategies, and in particular, national adaptation strategies, as well as sustainable development principles and objectives that would be encompassed in national sustainable development strategies, as well as poverty alleviation strategies. While these reports have been very useful, particularly for national-level planning, there is also need for additional tools that meet the needs of other users. The proposed pilot project is intended to focus at a more local level and to provide a process of assessing and minimizing risks that is suited to the capacities of local and regional organizations. During a workshop in October 2012, representatives from Indian Ocean countries identified many areas in which this type of economic assessment of climate change impacts and evaluation of adaptation strategies could be used. Possible ideas included screening climate change adaptation investments, managing the coastal zone, formulating policy, lobbying and advocating, raising community awareness and encouraging risk-reducing behavior, mobilizing resources, both public and private, helping to gain international funding for adaptation and risk reduction, governance, assessing technology needs, budgeting, in particular supporting budget allocations, international negotiations, designing risk insurance mechanisms, developing compensation estimates, and building human capacity. Let's take a few minutes now to consider an example of the existing risks from climate variability for a coastal community and how those risks may increase over time as a result of changes in settlement patterns and economic development as well as climate change. In the image, you can see a satellite photo of a coastal village that has a coral fringe reef on one side and also has a saltwater lagoon. This particular village has long been vulnerable to coastal flooding resulting from storm surges that occur during tropical storms and cyclones. The red shaded areas indicate the locations that are flooded to a depth of at least half a meter. Even if there was no climate change, this village would continue to expect regular damage to occur from existing climate conditions. Like most other coastal villages, however, this community is experiencing an increasing population. As well, it is becoming a popular tourist destination. The increasing population and the growing tourism sector have led to considerable development along the coast and interior areas, as shown in the second photo from 2013. Because there is now more infrastructure located in the areas where there was no settlement in 1990, there's now more damage every time flooding from storm surges occurs. Over the coming decades, climate change is expected to result in warmer ocean surface temperatures in the region, which is projected to result in more frequent and more intense storm activity. Consequently, damage from storm surges is expected to increase as a result of climate change. Because damage from weather-related events is affected by existing vulnerabilities, socioeconomic development, and climate change, the economic assessment process has several steps. In the diagram, time is represented on the horizontal axis. Climate risk, which in this example is the damage to infrastructure from coastal flooding, is shown on the vertical axis. In the absence of climate change or socioeconomic development, the baseline risk from climate variability is shown by the blue line. The first step in the economic assessment process is to determine the damage from historic climate variability. The second step in the assessment process is to develop a future projection of socioeconomic development to predict the additional damage that will occur because of the construction of more infrastructure and the creation of local livelihoods in high-risk areas. The third step is to develop climate change projections to predict the changes in the frequency and intensity of damaging weather events and the additional costs that they will impose on the village. The fourth step is to identify actions that could be taken to reduce the damage from climate events and promote any beneficial aspects of climate change. This is climate change adaptation. The green line represents the residual or remaining risk to the village over time after adaptation options have been implemented. Adaptation can include either public actions, such as building a seawall to reduce inundation, or private actions, such as raising a house up on poles to prevent flood damage. As there are likely many possible adaptation options that could be implemented, it is necessary to consider not only how cost-effective they are, but also whether or not they're consistent with long-term social and environmental objectives. To summarize, the steps in the economic assessment process are: first, identifying and measuring, that is, quantifying, the impacts of existing climate variability and projected climate change in selected sectors or regions. 2. Developing socioeconomic development scenarios, establishing impact damage functions, and converting physical impacts into monetary units. 3. Aggregating the costs of climate impacts for different sectors over long periods of time. 4. Identifying possible adaptation options and calculating the costs and benefits of their implementation. 5. Using multi-criteria analysis and other decision-making techniques to take into account social, environmental, and economic objectives. 6. replicating the process in other sectors while mainstreaming it into planning and investment decisions at various levels of government. In the next video, we'll go through these steps in more detail with some examples so you'll have a clear understanding of the time and resources needed to conduct an economic assessment of climate change impacts and adaptation strategies.